What's up, folks? How's it going? This is Waj. Hope you guys are all doing well. And today we're going to be talking about the Surface Pro X. We've been testing it for the past few weeks. And what we want to do in this video is specifically compare it against the standard Surface Pro 7. Now, there's some key differences about both of these tablets. Firstly, they're running on essentially the same architecture. It's a foldable tablet that has a built-in kickstand and running the full version of Windows 10. Now, there's a big change in terms of design philosophy, ports and connectivity options, and internal specifications between the two, which we'll go over. Ultimately, the Surface Pro X is supposedly a more premium version of the Surface Pro 7, but in many ways falls short of that distinction, but also has some perks that you won't find on the standard Surface Pro 7. Now, firstly, in terms of the looks and design of the Surface Pro X, you can see it's a lot more modernized version of the Surface Pro lineup of tablets, and essentially the Surface Pro 7 looks exactly the same as the past few generations of the Surface Pro tablet. Now, we do have a larger overall screen, thinner bezels, a slightly smaller footprint, as well as being thinner in terms of overall thickness, measuring around 7.3 millimeters versus 8.5 millimeters. There's not a big weight difference between the two, and in terms of the screen parameters, you're looking at Pixel Sense technology on both platforms, different dimensions and native resolutions, 13 inches on the Surface Pro X versus 12.3-inch display on the Surface Pro 7 with different native resolutions, but the same pixel density count of 267 ppi, as well as the same aspect ratio, same capabilities in terms of interfacing with all the different Microsoft peripherals out there, including the Surface Pen, the Surface Dial, and other items. And the overall display quality and experience is pretty much identical across both platforms. The only real major difference is the slightly larger display size and the thinner overall bezels on the Surface Pro X. Now, the ports and connectivity options on the Surface Pro X right now are a little bit limited compared to what you get with the standard Surface Pro 7, in the fact that the new Surface Pro 7 does have USB-C integration, as well as a standard USB Type-A 3.0 connection, a headphone jack, user expandable memory via the microSD expansion slot. And if you take a look at the Surface Pro X, we have two USB-C connections, no headphone jack, no SD card reader, and no USB Type-A connection. So that's definitely a little bit less versatile, especially for legacy support and things like that. Additionally, the new Surface Pen, although looks really cool, ergonomically feels really nice, and is functionally identical to the standard Surface Pen, actually has a dedicated spot on the typeface cover with the Surface Pro X. And the pen also wirelessly charges through the type cover, which is definitely cool. And if you do want to use the tablet with the Surface Pen by itself without the type cover, there are some magnetic points where the pen will actually latch on to the tablet, but it's a little bit more cumbersome compared to the standard dedicated points that we have on the Surface Pro 7. So if you use the pen in conjunction with the tablet itself, excluding the keyboard at certain times, that might be a little bit more cumbersome on the Surface Pro X compared to the standard Surface Pro 7. Now, coming back to that premium factor, the Surface Pro X starts at around $1,000 versus right now you can get the i3 version of the Surface Pro 7 that we have actually over here for $699 on sale. The regular price is $749, and if you want to get the more comparable i5 model to what we have on the SQ1 processor on the Surface Pro X, that is around $899 for the 128 gigabyte internal storage capacity, which is still $100 cheaper than the baseline configuration of the Surface Pro X, which essentially has one CPU option thus far. Now let's take a look at the benchmark results and see how these two compare against each other in terms of the Geekbench score specifically. Now I'm also going to throw up the i5 version of the Surface Pro 7 results. And as you can see from a single core perspective, the SQ1 processor is not really performing that well. It's only getting around 700 points versus you're looking at 1100 points for the i3 version and around 1200 points for the i5 version of the Surface Pro 7. In terms of multi-core performance, we are faster on the SQ1 chip at 2800 points compared to 2300 points on the dual-core i3 processor. But if you take a look at the quad-core with hyper-threading enabled i5 processor, it's actually getting 4400 points, which is significantly faster than the 2800 points that we're getting on the SQ1 8-core processor on the Surface Pro X. Now, in terms of the graphical performance, I use 3D Mark benchmarks, night rate synthetic benchmark to evaluate the GPU performance. And on the Surface Pro X, using the Adreno 685 GPU, we got a fairly decent result of 6,900 points, versus you're looking at 4,800 points on the i3 version and about 6,700 points on the i5, which is using 10th generation integrated Iris graphics from Intel. Now, besides the raw performance difference, there's a huge limitation to using the SQ1 processor on the Surface Pro X due to the fact that it's based around the ARM architecture, and there are dozens of applications that I use on a daily basis, such as the Adobe Suite and a number of other creation tools that simply are not compatible with ARM-based CPUs. So that's definitely a huge downfall for anybody that's a serious creator out there and is in the market for a tablet laptop replacement PC. And that's where the Surface Pro 7 really shines, especially if you get the upgraded i5 or i7 version. It's a totally capable machine, versatile enough to handle any Windows-based application. Now, moving on, in terms of the wireless capabilities, they're both pretty much identical in terms of having AC Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 5.0 compatibility. The only key difference is that we have LTE support on the Surface Pro X, so if you want internet everywhere, that is an option only available on the Surface Pro X for the time being. And if we take a look at some of the other key distinctions, we also have upgraded cameras on the Surface Pro X, both front to back, with the ability to do 10 megapixel stills and 4K video at the rear facing camera, versus the Surface Pro 7 is limited to 8 megapixel stills and 1080p video. Furthermore, a huge advantage of that SQ1 processor is that even though we have a slightly smaller battery configuration, 40 watt hours versus 45 watt hours on the Surface Pro 7, it is definitely a lot more efficient in terms of its battery performance. Microsoft claims up to 13 hours of general use versus 10.5 hours on the Surface Pro 7, and we did our own battery life drain test in which we played a video and we got a continuous runtime of about 12 hours and 4 minutes on the Surface Pro X versus only 8 hours and 19 minutes on the Surface Pro 7. So if you're looking for battery life, the Surface Pro X definitely has that edge up over the Surface Pro 7. Now, in summary, I definitely think that the Surface Pro X aesthetically is a beautiful looking device. It's up there with some of the best tablets from an aesthetic perspective, ultra thin bezels, and it modernizes the Surface Pro design to a great extent. But in several different aspects, it's a very limited and handicapped compared to the standard model. Essentially, if you're using that ARM-based CPU, you're not going to be able to run some of your favorite applications that you do on a day-to-day basis on your regular Windows machine that's running an AMD or Intel-based CPU. Additionally, you don't have the same level of versatility in the fact that we still have a USB Type-A connection on the Surface Pro 7 and a user expandable memory via the micro SD expansion slot, which is pretty important. And plus, from a financial perspective, you can save about $300 by getting the i3 version and still about $100 with the i5 version, which is superior in terms of multi-core processing. Not to mention, it doesn't have any of the limitations as we discussed before. And if we take a look at the small advantages that we do have in terms of the thinner overall bezels, the LTE support, the better batteries, and camera configuration on the Surface Pro X, I don't think those things outweigh the cons thus far. And ultimately, if you're in the market for a Windows-based laptop replacement tablet, I definitely think the king of the hill is still the Surface Pro 7. But besides that, guys, that's really it. Definitely love to hear your thoughts on the Surface Pro X. Do you think it's worth it? Do you think it's not worth it? What do you think of my opinion? Give us a thumbs up if you like this video. Check out the description down below for more details about everything we talked about. And make sure you have post notifications turned on, so once you get our video, it becomes available to you. Big thanks for your support, and big thanks for watching. Take care.